Have you ever noticed how people treat an INFJ differently the moment they stop explaining themselves? It's almost instant, like the entire dynamic shifts, and suddenly the people who once demanded answers don't know how to handle the silence. Why does this happen? Why does an INFJ's quiet withdrawal create more tension than their words ever did? And what exactly changes in the minds of the people around them when the explaining stops? In this video, you're going to discover the psychological switch that flips inside others the moment an INFJ steps out of the role of the one who always clarifies, justifies, and reassures. Most people never realize how powerful this moment truly is, or how much they reveal about themselves when the INFJ finally goes quiet. If you click away early, you'll miss the part where everything makes sense, why certain people panic, why others pull back, and why a few finally show their true intentions. Before we go deeper, answer this in the comments so I know who's watching. Have you ever stopped explaining and watched people change instantly? And if you're new here, subscribe to Brainy Quiet Mind, because once you understand what actually happens when an INFJ stops explaining, you'll never see your silence the same way again. When INFJs stop explaining, people lose the emotional control they once had over them. There's a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when an INFJ decides to stop justifying themselves. It doesn't come with anger, confrontation, or long conversations. It arrives like a shift in the air, a change in emotional gravity, and the people around them feel it immediately, often before the INFJ says a single word. For years, some individuals relied on the INFJ's explanations as a subtle form of control, the reassurance, the over-clarifying, the emotional labor that kept the peace, smoothed misunderstandings, and protected fragile egos. But when the INFJ finally stops explaining, that emotional leash snaps. Suddenly, the dynamic changes. The person who once expected answers now receives silence. The one who depended on the INFJ's emotional generosity now stands alone with their discomfort, no longer buffered by the INFJ's careful, gentle interpretations of everything that went wrong. Inside the INFJ, this shift is not impulsive. It's the result of too many moments where they explained themselves to people who had no intention of listening, understanding, or changing. They begin to see that explaining has become a currency others freely spend without giving anything in return. And something clicks. The INFJ realizes that every explanation they offered was actually giving the other person emotional power. Power to dismiss, to twist, to invalidate, to rely on the INFJ to fix the emotional tension. So they stop, not out of coldness, but out of clarity. They withdraw the explanations that once held the relationship together, and the silence becomes a mirror revealing the truth about the other person's intentions. Without the INFJ's emotional translations, people have to face their own behavior raw and unfiltered. For some, this loss of control is deeply unsettling. They become defensive, confused, even irritated, not because the INFJ is wrong, but because they no longer have access to the emotional comfort they depended on. The INFJ's silence forces them into emotional self-reliance, something they may have avoided for years. Manipulators feel powerless. Emotionally immature individuals feel exposed. Even well-meaning people feel the sudden weight of accountability they once subconsciously avoided. The INFJ, meanwhile, stands calmer than ever, grounded in a strength that doesn't need explanation. Their silence is not withdrawal, it's emancipation. And everyone around them feels the shift, because an INFJ who no longer explains is an INFJ who can no longer be controlled. Silence forces others to confront their own behavior instead of relying on the INFJ's clarity. INFJs spend much of their lives carrying emotional weight that doesn't belong to them. They interpret mixed signals, soften harsh truths, translate unspoken emotions, and explain misunderstandings before they grow into conflict. People become accustomed to this emotional guidance without even realizing it. But when the INFJ finally goes silent, when they stop filling in the blanks, stop smoothing over tension, stop clarifying what others refuse to own, the entire dynamic fractures. Suddenly, the people who relied on the INFJ to interpret their behavior are left face to face with themselves, and that confrontation is far more uncomfortable than any words the INFJ could ever offer. Silence in the hands of an INFJ becomes a mirror. And not everyone is ready to see their own reflection. Inside the INFJ's mind, choosing silence is not an act of punishment, it's an act of self-preservation. They've learned that explaining someone else's behavior only enables it. They've learned that offering clarity for someone who refuses accountability only keeps them trapped in a role they never chose. The INFJ's silence is a boundary, firm, calm, and deeply intentional. When they stop clarifying what someone meant, or how someone felt, or why someone acted a certain way, the responsibility shifts back where it always belonged. The person can no longer hide behind the INFJ's empathy, can no longer depend on their emotional translations. They must finally confront the truth of their own words, actions, and inconsistency. This is where discomfort begins to rise. People who depended on the INFJ's explanation suddenly feel exposed. The excuses they once leaned on don't work anymore. Their patterns become harder to deny. Their emotional outbursts or passive-aggressive comments no longer get cleaned up by someone else's insight. They're forced to face the impact of their behavior without a buffer. And that sense of accountability, especially when it arrives through silence rather than confrontation, can feel overwhelming. The INFJ isn't arguing, they're not correcting, they're not fixing. They've simply stepped back, and the absence of their emotional effort reveals everything that words could never make clear. The powerful truth is this: a silence illuminates what others desperately try to blur. Without the INFJ's clarity holding everything together, people must sit with the raw consequences of their choices. And that is why INFJ silence feels so intense, because it forces others to confront parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. Without explanations, manipulative people can no longer twist the INFJ's words. Manipulative people thrive in conversations where the INFJ explains themselves. Every clarification becomes raw material they can reshape, distort, or weaponize. They twist the INFJ's empathy into guilt, their honesty into obligation, their clarity into self-blame. But the moment the INFJ stops explaining, when they answer with silence instead of paragraphs, the manipulator loses their playground. There is nothing to twist, nothing to bend, nothing to use against them. The INFJ's silence becomes an unbreakable wall, and for the first time, the manipulator must face the reality that their usual tactics have nowhere to attach. It is in this moment that the emotional power shifts instantly and dramatically, without the INFJ raising their voice or defending themselves. Inside the INFJ, the shift towards silence is a turning point. They've seen the pattern too many times. They try to clarify their intentions, but the manipulator rewires the narrative to fit their agenda. They try to express how they feel, but somehow the conversation ends with the INFJ apologizing. They offer explanations to prevent conflict, only to watch their words twisted into traps. Eventually, the INFJ realizes that the problem isn't their communication, it's the listen. So they stop feeding the manipulation, they remove the oxygen, they let the silence speak instead. And in that stillness, the INFJ feels a deep, undeniable reclaiming of their own voice. For the manipulative person, silence is a crisis. They can't twist what isn't spoken. They can't distort a story that no longer has new pieces. They can't provoke guilt, confusion, or self-doubt when the INFJ gives them nothing but calm distance. So they scramble, they push harder, they try to provoke a reaction. They may accuse the INFJ of being cold, distant, or unfair, anything to restart the emotional cycle that once gave them power. But it doesn't work, because the INFJ has stepped out of the game entirely. Their silence is not avoidance. It is liberation from psychological exploitation. What manipulative people fear most about INFJ silence is not the absence of words, it is the loss of control. They realize the INFJ sees through them, that the emotional hooks they relied on have dissolved. And this fear is justified, because once an INFJ stops explaining, they become untouchable. Their boundaries rise, their self-respect strengthens, and the manipulator is left exposed, holding on to tactics that no longer have any effect. Silence becomes the INFJ's shield and their freedom. People who took advantage of the INFJ's patience suddenly feel exposed and uncomfortable. When an INFJ finally stops explaining, the people who quietly fed off their patience feel the shift like a cold wind. These are the ones who stretched the INFJ's kindness to its limits, who relied on their emotional endurance, who assumed the INFJ would always give one more chance, one more explanation, one more soft landing. But the moment the INFJ withdraws that patience, the moment their silence replaces their soothing words, those same people feel exposed in a way they've never experienced. They sense that the emotional shield they used to hide behind is gone. The INFJ's presence once softened their flaws, covered their inconsistencies, and made their behavior seem less harsh. Without it, everything stands in the open, and that exposure is deeply uncomfortable. Inside the INFJ, this change is not sudden. It is the result of 1,000 quiet disappointments they carried without complaint. They tolerated lateness, selfishness, dismissive words, and emotional neglect, not because they were blind, but because they cared. They gave understanding long after others stopped deserving it. But every act of patience had a cost, and eventually the INFJ realized they were paying more than the connection was worth. When they stop explaining, it isn't a reaction, it's a recognition. They finally see who would still show up when patience runs out. And when many people fail that test, the INFJ's silence becomes a boundary that no one can cross without confronting their own behavior. For those who took advantage, this silence feels like judgment. Even though the INFJ is not judging anyone, it feels like rejection even though the INFJ simply stepped back. It feels like the truth, because now there's nowhere left for the truth to hide. People who depended on the INFJ's endless patience start to feel their own harshness, their own entitlement, their own emotional laziness. They sense the weight of their actions for the first time, because the INFJ is no longer carrying it for them. The INFJ's silence forces them to finally look at who they were in the relationship, stripped of the cushioning effect of the INFJ's kindness. And this is why they become uncomfortable, not because the INFJ changed, but because the INFJ stopped protecting them from themselves. When the INFJ withdraws patience, the dynamic becomes painfully honest, and those who took advantage are confronted with a reality they never expected. The INFJ saw everything, endured everything, and walked away without a single word. The INFJ's withdrawal reveals who valued them for their voice versus who valued them for their compliance. When an INFJ withdraws, the shift is subtle but seismic. The silence that replaces their explanations becomes a test no one realizes they're taking. Those who genuinely valued the INFJ's insight, empathy, and emotional clarity feel the change immediately, and they step closer. They ask what's wrong, they listen more carefully. They treat the INFJ's silence as a sign of depth, not defiance. But the ones who valued the INFJ only for their compliance, for their willingness to smooth conflict, carry emotional weight, and absorb stress, react in a very different way. The withdrawal exposes the truth. Some people never appreciated the INFJ's voice at all. They only appreciated the convenience of having someone who explained, interpreted, reassured, and softened every interaction. Without that compliance, the connection loses all its false stability. Inside the INFJ, this revelation is something they've sensed long before the moment of withdrawal. They notice the difference between people who seek them out to hear their perspective and those who seek them out to use their patience. They can feel who values their mind and who values their silence. But INFJs often give the benefit of the doubt, continuing to show up with warmth and clarity, even when the relationship feels unbalanced. It's only when the emotional cost becomes undeniable that the INFJ steps back. And when they do, the reactions they receive become a map of people's true intentions. Those who cared respond with understanding. Those who cared only about compliance respond with frustration, confusion, or distance. The INFJ's withdrawal without a single word reveals the entire architecture of the relationship. This is where the uncomfortable truth surfaces. Some people only liked the version of the INFJ who filled the silence, fixed the misunderstandings, and made relationships easier. They didn't value the INFJ's heart. They valued the emotional labor that came with it. When that labor is gone, their interest collapses. They become cold, irritated, or dismissive, not because the INFJ did something wrong, but because the INFJ stopped serving a function they relied on. And in that reaction, the INFJ sees something they cannot unsee: who was there for connection and who was there for comfort. What makes this moment powerful is how quietly it unfolds. The INFJ doesn't expose anyone. They don't call out the truth, they simply stop offering explanations, and the world separates itself. Some people lean in, some drift away, some grow, some resent, and the INFJ watches, calm and observant, as the difference becomes undeniable. Their withdrawal reveals what words never could, who truly valued them, and who only valued their compliance. Stopping explanations signals a shift in power. The INFJ is no longer emotionally available. When an INFJ stops explaining, the power dynamic of the relationship changes instantly, even if the other person can't articulate why. For so long, the INFJ's emotional availability made everything feel balanced. Conversations, conflicts, misunderstandings, all softened by their presence. Their explanations were more than words, they were bridges that carried the emotional weight others didn't know how to hold. But when the INFJ removes those bridges, when silence replaces reassurance, when calm distance replaces emotional labor, something fundamental shifts. Suddenly, the INFJ is no longer accessible in the way they once were. That emotional availability people depended on is gone, and with it goes a quiet form of power those same people never acknowledged until it disappears. Inside the INFJ, this withdrawal is not a performance, it's a realization. They see how much emotional energy they've poured into people who offered little in return. They recognize how their explanations became a lifeline for others but a drain for themselves. They stop because they're tired of carrying both sides of the emotional equation, tired of giving clarity to people who choose confusion, tired of offering understanding to those who refuse growth. When they step back, it is not out of anger, but out of necessity. They reclaim the emotional energy they once handed out freely, and that reversal of flow signals a shift that cannot be ignored. For others, this shift feels jarring. The person who once relied on the INFJ to interpret their intentions or soothe their insecurities now feels abandoned. The ones who counted on the INFJ's emotional availability feel the sudden absence like a door quietly closing. And those who depended on the INFJ to maintain harmony realize they have to face their own emotional responsibilities, something they may have avoided for years. The balance flips. The INFJ is no longer the emotional anchor. Their silence declares without a single word that they are no longer participating in the emotional contract that once defined the relationship. And that is where the true power shift occurs. Emotional availability is invisible until it's gone. The INFJ's silence becomes a statement. I will no longer be the one who holds everything together. People who once relied on their empathy now must stand in their own emotional weight, and many find it uncomfortable, even frightening. The INFJ doesn't punish, doesn't argue, doesn't chase. Their silence is simply the moment they take their power back, and everyone around them feels it. Their silence becomes a boundary, and people react to boundaries based on their true intentions. When an INFJ stops explaining, their silence becomes more than a pause in conversation. It becomes a boundary, a quiet, firm, unmistakable boundary that separates those who genuinely care from those who only cared when the INFJ was easy to access, easy to persuade, easy to lean on. And the reactions to this silence reveal everything. Healthy, sincere people respect it. They step back without resentment. They reflect. They ask if the INFJ is all right. They adjust their behavior with empathy because they value the INFJ's well-being more than their own comfort. But those who are benefiting from the INFJ's emotional availability react very differently. They become irritated, defensive, confused, or even angry. The silence exposes their intentions. They didn't want the INFJ, they wanted the access. Inside the INFJ, choosing silence as a boundary is a rare but powerful decision. They do not enjoy pulling back. They do not set boundaries lightly. INFJs usually try to maintain harmony, offer understanding, and give second chances long after others would have walked away. But when they reach the point where explanations no longer feel meaningful or safe, silence becomes their strongest form of self-protection. It is not punishment, it is preservation. Their silence says, I will not carry this alone. down anymore. It says, I will not keep giving where nothing returns. And it says, if you want to be in my life, you must show me through your actions, not your assumptions. This clarity is what turns silence into a boundary that cannot be negotiated. The impactful part is how quickly the truth surfaces once that boundary appears. People with good intentions respond with patience and humility. They give the INFJ space and offer understanding. They don't take the silence personally. They see the INFJ's withdrawal as an opportunity to reflect and rebuild something stronger. But people with selfish, manipulative, or shallow intentions react with entitlement. They demand explanations, accuse the INFJ of overreacting, or try to guilt trip them back into compliance. They are frustrated not because the INFJ changed, but because they lost the emotional access they never respected in the first place. And this is the revelation silence brings. Everyone shows who they are when they are denied the version of the INFJ that served them. Their reactions become confessions, raw, unfiltered, revealing exactly what the INFJ needed to see. Silence becomes truth. Silence becomes protection. Silence becomes a boundary far louder than words could ever be. When an INFJ stops explaining, everything shifts. Not because they became colder, but because the truth finally had room to reveal itself. Silence exposes intentions, reveals hidden dynamics, and shows who was there for connection and who was there for convenience. And if you've ever felt the power of pulling back, even for a moment, you already know how quickly people show their real selves when your explanations disappear. Before you go, answer this in the comments. Have you ever stopped explaining and watched someone change instantly? Type no more explanations if you stayed until the end. And if you're new here, subscribe to Brainy Quiet Mind. The next videos will explain exactly why silence becomes an INFJ's strongest form of boundaries, protection, and power.